All right, guys, welcome back to the show. We're going to get right into our third segment of the day. We're going to do top 5 edge rushers in the NFL. And this has always been a point of conversation for me amongst other fans of the NFL when I talk about best pass rushers in the league, because I have my own opinions and they differ from some other people's opinions, particularly two particular guys that are edge rushers. And we'll get to that here in a second. But let's just go ahead and get right into the list here. Number 5, I have Max Crosby of the Las Vegas Raiders. I always feel like saying the Oakland Raiders. I don't think I'll ever get over that because they're the Oakland Raiders to me. They're not the Vegas Raiders. But, you know, it is what it is. But I have Max Crosby, 22 sacks in the last 2 years. 22 sacks in the last 2 years for Max Crosby. He has 59.5 total career sacks. Obviously just signed a pretty big, massive deal for the Raiders in the offseason to keep him there, along with the new head coaching staff and, you know, new offense that they have with Geno Smith and Pete Carroll as the head coach. But Max Crosby, there was talk that he could potentially go somewhere else in the offseason, you know, but I personally don't. I mean, obviously it's not going to happen because he signed the deal, but before he signed that deal, there was that rumor that maybe he could, you know, be traded somewhere else, maybe to Detroit, who were in need of another edge rusher outside of Aiden Hutchinson, but didn't actually end up happening. And I'm kind of glad that it didn't, because I feel like Max Crosby is a Raider through and through. I couldn't imagine him on any other team, and he's definitely top 5. When you're talking about the Raiders, every time you go up against the Raiders, that's usually the first name that you circle is, okay, we need to get an eye on Max Crosby. We need to find a way to shut him down so he doesn't wreck our, you know, offensive game plan, because he's absolutely capable of doing that. Last year, he didn't have a ton of sacks. He only had, I think it was like about 4.5 sacks, something like that last year. Or maybe I'm getting my years mixed up, because one of the last 2 years, he only had about 4 sacks or so, but he typically is right around the range of about 7 to 10 sacks. But he does more than just, you know, sack the quarterback. He's a good run stopper as well, and he's just good at, you know, getting that pressure. A lot of stats that you don't see on the stat sheet, or a lot of things that he does you don't see on the stat sheet, I should say. You know, so I think he's definitely one of those guys that's in that top tier list of edge rushers. He could drastically improve your defensive line no matter who he ends up going to or whatever the case. But I think he's going to end up ending his career with the Raiders, which I think is rightfully so, because he just seems like a Raider to me. And it just would be weird to see him in any other color. I would love to see him in the black and gold, of course, but you know, he's a Raider too, so there's kind of that old history. It's like, do you really want a Raider in the Steelers building, you know, with all that history? But you know, that's more for the older people who watched the Steelers back in the day. They've always had been Raiders rivals, but they don't really play much anymore. So, you know, it's not really as much of a rivalry as it used to be, of course. But Max Crosby, number 5. So don't want to get too far off track here. Number 4, I have Micah Parsons of the Cowboys. He was drafted in 2021, has 52.5 career sacks, and has had at least 12 sacks every single year. He is obviously a very, very good edge rusher. He's incredibly explosive, a very, very fast guy. He can wreck a game. He can take over a game. I've seen him do it a number of times against teams. He will just completely take over the game. And the Cowboys, they need as much of that as they can get, because with Overshown getting hurt last year, and he was actually really, really showing some really good signs that he could be a very good player to pair with Micah Parsons. But the other thing with the Cowboys is, are they going to sign Micah Parsons, because he is one of those guys that's going to be up for a contract here soon. And with Myles Garrett getting his monster deal, and Trey Hendrickson trying to get a deal, and TJ Watt expected to get an extension at some point in the offseason, you would think Micah Parsons he's getting close to being due, and he's going to want a pretty good amount of money, most likely, to stay in Dallas, or maybe he moves on somewhere else. But with the way he talked about Dexter Lawrence when Dexter Lawrence left for Seattle, kind of makes me think that maybe he'll stay in Dallas for the majority, or if not his entire career. But who knows? You know, he could have just been saying that to get people to like his podcast that, you know, he has. So who knows? Money always talks. So if another team ever offered him more, I'm sure he would be the first person that would want to go, despite giving Dexter Lawrence a lot of grief for what he said about the Cowboys. Micah Parsons would probably do the same thing if he was offered Myles Garrett money, for example, to play somewhere else. But Micah Parsons is still very, very good. Drafted from Penn State, of course, who are very good at creating, these big-time defensive players, at least, recently with, of course, Abdul Carter, who's sporting that same number 11 when he was at Penn State. He's coming out, and he's one of the best edge rushers in the draft. He's actually considered by a lot of people arguably the best player overall in this draft. And he is at edge rusher. Titans were talking about maybe getting him. Even the Browns were talking about possibly drafting him. I've seen that floated around in some mock drafts too, which would be an interesting pairing to have Abdul Carter and Myles Garrett there too. But so Micah Parsons I have in number 4. I think that's pretty solid for him. Number 3, I have Trey Hendrickson. He led the league last year with 17.5 sacks, and that is actually his career high, which he also had the year before. So that's 2 consecutive years where he's had 17.5 sacks. So obviously that's very, very good. He was drafted by the Saints back in 2017, had 77 career sacks so far in his career. And he's, of course, trying to work on a deal with the Bengals to stay there after they had, of course, re-signed T. Higgins and Jamar Chase as well. So he would be another domino that would need to fall for the Bengals to just keep that core together. But Hendrickson would be wanted by just about every team in the league, I would think, because he's that good. He's a great edge rusher, can get to the quarterback, of course, but he can stop the run very well, too. Just the problem with the Bengals is they don't have a great defense outside of Trey Hendrickson. He's by far their best player on defense. So, he gets a lot of the shine and rightfully so, because he's the one that's always making plays for the Bengals. And if they want to get to where they need to get to, which is a Super Bowl, which is what their goal is, they need to keep Trey Hendrickson somehow, because if they lose him to an already ailing defense, that defense is just going to continue to give up big plays like they did last year. So lock Trey Hendrickson down. He's one of the best edge rushers in the game for sure. So you definitely want to lock him down. And he's number 3 on my list. Now, let's get to the 2 that I really, really wanted to talk about here. And number 2 I have, and I'm sure a lot of people will disagree, and they'll probably have this flip-flopped, and maybe they will have a completely different list altogether. But I have Myles Garrett at number 2 for Cleveland. Drafted by the Browns in 2017, he has 102.5 career sacks, 14 sacks in the last 2 seasons, and of course he won Defensive Player of the Year back in 2023. Now, I feel like I'm pretty harsh on Myles Garrett, because I do believe that he is a great defensive player and will probably go down in the Hall of Fame by the end of his career. I have no bones about that. Definitely believe that that's the case. He's that good of a player. I just have never thought that he was better than the guy who's sitting at number 1, and which is TJ Watt. So instead of just doing 2 and 1, we're just going to combine these 2, because this is a comparison that gets made a lot between these 2 guys, is whether or not Myles is the better edge rusher or best edge rusher in the league, and TJ Watt not so much. The only thing that's really hurting TJ Watt is that he has had injuries in recent years. Myles Garrett hasn't really had to deal with too many injuries over the course of his career. He's been dinged up a few times, but nothing really major. And though TJ Watt has never missed an entire season before, he's missed a lot of games, and the Steelers don't do very well when he doesn't play. And Myles Garrett, of course, the thing with Myles Garrett that I personally have an issue with is he tends to fade towards the end of the year. Like the year that he won Defensive Player of the Year, I don't think he should have won Defensive Player of the Year. You could call that me being biased, call that me being a homer, whatever you want to call it. But TJ Watt had better numbers in every single statistical category over Myles Garrett. He had more sacks, more forced fumbles, more tackles for loss, more tackles overall, more interceptions. He did everything better than Myles Garrett. But TJ Watt, for some reason, gets consistently hated on by whoever it is who comes up with these, awards or votes on these awards. It's a popularity contest as far as Defensive Player of the Year. And TJ Watt has been snubbed a number of times for that award. He leads the league in sacks just about every year. I mean, seemingly. He's led the league in sacks in 3 different seasons, just to be, exact. And that is more than any other player in NFL history has ever done. And he is also has tied the record that Michael Strahan set back in the day of the single season sack record of 22 and a half sacks. He did that in 2021 when he won his only Defensive Player of the Year award. But he did that in less games than Michael Strahan did as well, because TJ missed a few games that particular season due to injury and really should have broken the record in that game against Baltimore, but he had a sack that was called back because of a penalty on the defense. Otherwise, he would have had the record, so he is an absolute monster. And there is a reason why he gets chipped and double and triple teamed on every single play, is because you have to. Because if you don't, he will eat you alive, and he will eat your offensive line alive. That's TJ Watt, healthy, is better than any other rusher in this league. And I know a lot of people will maybe not a lot of people, but some people will disagree with me there, because people have this love affair with Myles Garrett, thinking that he's somehow better than TJ Watt, and he's just not. I'm sorry, he's just not. Myles Garrett is a tremendous defensive player, tremendous edge rusher, and any team would be incredibly lucky to have him. No disrespect to Myles Garrett at all for his ability to play on the field. He's an incredible player, but TJ Watt is a better edge rusher. Just look at the stats. That's all you got to do. Look at the stats. He's the better player, period. Last year was kind of a down year for TJ Watt, and he still managed 11 and a half sacks. That's a down year for TJ Watt. There are a lot of defensive players in the NFL that will go their entire career and not have a season in which they have 11 and a half sacks. That's a down year for TJ. He played most of the year, but he didn't have a great year, admittedly. And this was one of the few years that he did not get snubbed for Defensive Player of the Year. Pat Surtain won it, and I think he deserved to win it, because TJ just didn't have the numbers last year. But if you're talking about overall body of work, TJ Watt's the better player, period. The only thing that's a knock on TJ is injuries and the fact that he has not won a playoff game, but that is not his fault. He is the best player on that team and has been since he became the starter. He's been the best player on that team. Best player on that defense for sure, but I would argue that he's the best player on the team simply because you look at the record when he's not on the field. The Steelers don't win many games. I think they've won 1 game with TJ not on the field in his entire career, and they just have an incredibly bad record when he's not playing. And that shows you how important of a player he is, and why he should be defensive MVP, essentially, because he's the most valuable player on that defense, which is essentially what Defensive Player of the Year is, right? It's most valuable player on that particular defense. But I think the reason why Myles Garrett won it that particular year in 2023 was because, for some reason, people like Myles Garrett more than TJ Watt. I don't know what it is. It's strange to me as to why that is, but I think TJ's the better edge rusher, period, regardless of what all the pundits on ESPN or Pro Football Talk or Pro Football Focus, who have those wonderful pass rush win rate thing that they base everything on, and they think the best player in the NFL is a guy who almost gets to the quarterback but doesn't, over a guy that does get to the quarterback. So I don't want to vent too much, because I can go all day talking about that particular subject, because it just gets under my skin whenever I see that. But those are my list. Myles Garrett, number 2, TJ, number 1, and, of course, rounding out the rest of the 5, Max Crosby at 5, Micah Parsons at 4, Trey Hendrickson at 3. So that's my list for edge rushers. When we come back, we're going to do something a little bit different, something that we have not done on this show before, but is a way that I am kind of trying to get more people involved in topics on the show. If you have a question that you want to get heard, if you don't get a chance to do it in the super chat, you can always hit up one of these videos or one of the shorts that I do and do a mailbag, or some questions that we'll answer in a mailbag. I'd like to do this once a week if we get enough questions every week. Of course, there'll be a backup plan as always if we don't get enough questions, and I'll try and touch on some of the questions, week by week, depending on, what we get and all that. So before we get into that mailbag segment, though, we're going to take another break. And when we come back, we're going to get right into it. So just stick with us. We'll be right back.